You enter a space built for telling stories, but only certain ones. It feels polished, controlled, calm. The kind of room where nothing looks accidental, where every detail seems to have passed a quiet test before being allowed to stay. The stories are everywhere, on walls, on panels, on stands placed at careful distances from each other. Each one looks complete, finished. Nothing spills over, nothing feels messy. People move slowly through the room. They stop, they read, they nod. Some smile. Others lean in a little closer, as if proximity might make the story more real. No one rushes. The pace feels respectful, almost ceremonial. Each story follows a familiar shape. There was a struggle, then a turning point, then success. The middle is smooth, the edges are clean. Whatever didn't fit has been trimmed away. You notice how similar the stories feel, even when the details change. Different faces, different backgrounds, same arc, same resolution. The repetition is comforting, predictable in a good way. The room feels reassuring. It tells you that outcomes can be trusted, that progress leaves footprints, that success announces itself clearly if you know where to look. There's no mention of what failed, no false starts, no versions that didn't work. The room doesn't lie, it just doesn't include everything. Absence does the editing. People don't question that. They accept the selection as natural. After all, this is a room for success. Why would anything else be here? You can feel the quiet agreement forming. If these stories are displayed, they must represent something true, something repeatable, something worth believing in. Otherwise, why show them? The room teaches without explaining. It shows you what counts as proof: clear results, clean endings, stories that arrive where they were meant to. You begin to sense the unspoken rule. Success is not just achievement, it is presentation, it is coherence. It is knowing how to tell the story in a way that fits the room. People linger longest where the story feels most certain, where doubt has been removed so thoroughly that nothing sharp remains. Comfort draws attention more reliably than complexity. The room doesn't feel manipulative, it feels organized, helpful even. It offers examples, role models, evidence. It never says these are the only stories. It simply shows you which ones matter. By the time you leave, the shape of success feels familiar, almost obvious, like something you've seen many times before. The room doesn't ask you to believe every story. It asks you to believe in the pattern. And once that pattern settles in, each new story feels less like a question and more like confirmation. This is where Jung would stop reading the success stories and start watching what they quietly remove. Not what is shown, but what disappears so the story can feel clean. Every success story has a shadow. Not failure exactly, but everything that doesn't fit the arc. The hesitation, the doubt, the attempts that didn't work, the versions of the person that never arrived at the ending being displayed. In this room, those parts are not attacked. They are simply absent. And absence is powerful. When something is not shown, it begins to feel unnecessary, even embarrassing. Jung would notice how people begin to separate themselves into two versions: the self they live with now and the self they imagine becoming. The present self starts to feel temporary, like a rough draft, like something meant to be replaced. The shadow grows in that gap. All the traits that don't match the success story get pushed down. Confusion, slowness, ambivalence, complexity. These are not rewarded here, so they slip out of sight. What's interesting is how gentle this process feels. No one tells you to reject your current self. You do it quietly. You compare. You measure. You notice what the stories celebrate and what they ignore. Jung believed the shadow forms when parts of the self are denied rather than understood. In this space, denial looks like motivation, like aspiration, like hope. People start to narrate their own lives differently. They smooth the past, they shorten the struggle, they highlight the turning point, even to themselves, especially to themselves. The success story becomes a mirror, but not an honest one. It reflects an idealized version back at you and asks you to move toward it. Everything that doesn't reflect cleanly becomes something to hide. The crowd matters here. Seeing many similar success stories makes the shadow feel shared, normal. If everyone trimmed their story this way, it must be the right way to tell it. Jung would not say this desire is wrong. Wanting growth is human. Wanting coherence is human. But he would watch the cost. When only certain outcomes are visible, only certain selves feel acceptable. The rest sink quietly into the shadow, waiting. And the longer people live toward the story they are supposed to tell, the more unfamiliar their present self begins to feel. Not broken, just unfinished. The room never says that. It doesn't need to. The stories do the work. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche would listen to how success is framed as goodness. Not spoken loudly, but assumed. In this room, achievement doesn't just mean something worked. It means something was right. The success story carries approval. It feels clean, confident, finished. The struggle that led to it is no longer important. What matters is where it ended. The ending becomes the measure. Nietzsche would notice how morality slips in through outcomes. If a story ends well, it must have been lived well. If it looks right, it must be right. The visible result becomes a moral signal. No one says this directly. That's what makes it effective. The room doesn't argue for values. It displays them. It shows you what counts, what earns space, what deserves attention. The success story teaches a quiet rule. Progress is good. Stability is respectable. Completion is virtuous. Anything unfinished feels slightly suspect, slightly lacking. Nietzsche warned about moral systems that hide inside praise. Here, judgment does not come as criticism. It comes as admiration. Applause replaces evaluation. Approval replaces inquiry. People begin to judge themselves using the same lens. They ask, not, is this true? But does this look like success? Does it resemble what is already being celebrated? The crowd reinforces this gently. Stories that fit the pattern are repeated, shared, elevated. Stories that don't fit simply fade away, not rejected, just overlooked. Over time, the definition of success narrows. It starts to look familiar, predictable, safe. What falls outside that shape feels risky, harder to justify, harder to defend. Nietzsche would see how this creates moral comfort. You don't need to decide what is good. You can copy it. You can align with it. You can step into what already has approval. The danger isn't cruelty. It's softness. When morality feels pleasant, it stops feeling like a question. It becomes an atmosphere. Difference doesn't disappear here. It just stops being rewarded. And when reward is removed, belief follows quietly behind. Nietzsche would not deny the appeal of success. He would question what happens when morality is measured by results alone. When worth depends on presentation. When goodness has a recognizable look. In this room, morality does not demand belief. It surrounds it. And once success feels like virtue, people stop asking what they value. They start asking what wins. This is where Machiavelli would stop listening to the stories and start watching what they do. Not how inspiring they sound, but how they move people, how they direct attention, how they shape who is trusted next. Success stories are efficient tools. They don't argue. They demonstrate. They quietly suggest who deserves authority. If someone has reached this outcome, they must know something. If their story is shown, they must be worth following. Machiavelli would notice how power shifts from explanation to example. You don't need instructions when you have proof. You don't need debate when results are visible. The success story becomes a shortcut to legitimacy. What matters is not how many stories exist, but which ones are elevated, which are placed higher, which are given space, which are repeated. Power lives in selection. He would watch how responsibility moves away from systems and onto individuals. If someone succeeded, it proves the path works. If someone didn't, the fault must be personal. The structure stays untouched. Power remains clean. Success stories also protect authority from challenge. They end conversations early. Doubt feels impolite when proof is on display. Questioning looks unnecessary when outcomes appear settled. Machiavelli understood that power prefers certainty over truth. A clean narrative is more useful than a complex one. Success stories simplify reality into something that can be repeated, taught, and scaled. The crowd reinforces this quietly. When many people admire the same examples, influence compounds. The successful become reference points. Their choices feel validated. Their advice carries weight. Power doesn't need to force belief here. It benefits from admiration. People want to align with what looks effective. They want proximity to what appears to work. He would notice how elevation matters. Stories placed higher, centered, or highlighted feel more authoritative. Physical placement turns into psychological hierarchy. What is elevated feels important. What is lower fades. Machiavelli would see this as strategic, not malicious, just practical. When belief is guided by outcomes, power belongs to whoever controls which outcomes are shown. Success stories don't just prove possibility. They organize trust. They decide who speaks next. They quietly shape where effort flows and where doubt stops. In this room, power doesn't announce itself. It curates. And once the right stories are chosen, power no longer needs to act. The stories act for it. This is where Hill would lean forward. Not toward the struggle, but toward the result. Hill believed belief grows when it sees proof, and the success story offers proof without effort. You don't need to imagine the outcome. It's already there. Finished, framed, approved. The story has been chosen because it works as evidence. It feels safe to trust something that has already ended well. Hill would notice how repetition strengthens belief. One success story creates interest. Several create confidence. Many create expectation. When outcomes appear again and again, belief stops feeling optional. What matters is not how rare success is, it's how visible it is. The stories on display feel common, almost normal. That normality does the convincing. If this many people arrived here, then this must be the way. Belief forms quietly. You don't decide to trust the story. You absorb it. The shape of success becomes familiar, predictable, something you can picture yourself stepping into. Hill understood the power of example. Seeing someone else succeed reduces friction. It shortens the distance between desire and action. You don't ask if it's possible. You ask how soon. The gaps don't weaken belief. They protect it. Missing details leave space for imagination. People fill that space with hope, with effort, with belief in their own version of the story. When doubt appears, another success story answers it. Not with explanation, but with reassurance. Look, it worked again. Belief doesn't need certainty, it needs momentum. The crowd matters here too. Belief spreads faster when it's shared. When many people admire the same proof, trust multiplies. Confidence feels borrowed, but real. Hill would see how belief becomes self-sustaining. People act because they believe. Their action reinforces the system. New success stories are produced. The cycle continues. Failure doesn't break belief, it's reframed. Not the right time, not enough commitment. The promise stays intact. Belief survives because the proof remains visible. Nothing here feels dishonest. Some stories are real, some outcomes are genuine. That truth protects the belief from scrutiny. It doesn't need to work for everyone, just often enough. In this room, belief doesn't wait for evidence. It lives inside it. And once success looks familiar, belief feels less like a choice and more like the next reasonable step.